On the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea in Israel is a diamond-shaped rock known as Masada. It overlooks the north-south trade route that runs between the Judean hills and the Dead Sea. This was the main inland route for peoples and tribes travelling north from Egypt and south from Israel. Masada's location meant that it was ideal for a fort, and the Maccabean king Alexander was the first to make military use of the outcrop in the 1st century BC. Little remains of his period. It was King Herod the Great who built the strong fortifications, the remains of which we see today. In 40 BC, Herod was an influential Jewish nobleman who became involved in a civil war between two factions. One favoured Rome, the other Parthenia. As a supporter of Rome, Herod fled with his family to Masada. He then left his family here and went to Rome, where he was appointed King of Judea by the Roman Senate. In 37 BC, he returned to claim his crown, but fearful of revolt from the Jews, he built a royal sanctuary and fortress on Masada's summit. After Herod's death, Masada became a small Roman outpost. The Roman invasion of Palestine in the 1st century BC destroyed the Jewish hope of restoring their own government. Some Jewish groups, like the Zealots, insisted that Jews should fight against the Roman invaders. Their best-known leader, Judas the Galilean, led an ill-fated revolt against the decree by Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. He was killed, but in the following years, other leaders rose up to continue the battle against Rome. In 66 AD, the Roman garrison who occupied the fort here at Masada was attacked and slaughtered by the Dagger people, a radical group of zealots. With their families, they made Masada a stronghold of Jewish resistance. Throughout all of Palestine, Jewish revolt against the rule of Rome increased, and General Titus was given the job of restoring order by any means. Masada had been built to withstand drought and siege. There was plenty of water through a system of pipes and huge storage chambers hollowed out of the rock itself. These cisterns and channels collected the runoff from the infrequent rainfall. On top there were storerooms for dried fruits, nuts, wheat and grain. There was a bakery, a Roman bath and sauna complete with beautifully inlaid tiles. The Zealots considered themselves safe to live their religious life here, free from the influence of the Romans, but Titus had no intention of letting a small band of Jews get away with the murder of Roman soldiers and insurrection against the emperor. Titus had subdued the Jewish people. He'd conquered city after city and massacred the people. Now the last handful of Jewish zealots had retreated to the southernmost point of the land and had holed up here in the well-stocked and well-defended fort. Titus marched 10,000 Roman troops down and surrounded this mountain, but there was no way that he could win. So he decided to build an enormous ramp up the wall, more than 1,000 feet in height. What happened next was a classic example of siege warfare. Titus ordered Flavius Silva to take charge of the final assault upon Masada. He brought tens of thousands of Jewish slaves to build this huge earthen ramp, 1,300 feet high, up the side of the walls of Masada. The Romans were good engineers. They were well stocked, they had plenty of provisions, and they had 10,000 crack troops. They mounted a campaign, but they were against zealots who were religious in their fervour and devoted to God and their own survival. The Romans ran this 5-kilometre wall the whole way round so that no one could get out, and built 8 large siege camps to house their soldiers and others for the slaves. And then they built the ramp and slowly began to drag their huge war machines. It looked like Masada would fall. When the Romans burst through the wooden defences, they found nothing but 960 dead bodies. The Zealots had committed suicide. To them it was better to die proudly as a Jew than to live as Gentile slaves under the Romans. For 1900 years, Israel has gained strength from this place. Today, hundreds of thousands of tourists come here in order to draw on their history and to find some of the inspiration of what it means to be Jewish. For 1900 years, they looked to Masada as a symbol of the hope that one day they would be here in this land as their land. It was for them a tremendous symbol of what it meant to be courageous and strong, to refuse to accept slavery of any kind, and instead to live in their own land in freedom. Masada is a symbol of one of those dominating thoughts that has flowed through the life of Judaism. That thought is the Holocaust. It was a Holocaust that occurred here at Masada. It was a Holocaust by the Romans through Jerusalem, and then in latter centuries by the Spaniards, by the Arabs, by Adolf Hitler, by Joseph Stalin. And Holocaust is a concept that dominates Jewish thinking. But there are 3 other concepts I believe are very important to understand the Jewish mind. Anti-Semitism is a concept over the years that has dominated Jewish thinking, and the portrait of the Jew, as Shakespeare painted him as Shylock the moneylender, is a parody of Judaism. The third thought is Zionism. That is the determination to own this, their own land, and keep it come what may. And the fourth thing is Messianianism. That is a concern for the coming of the Messiah. Now, there are Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews and conservative Jews, but there are also Messianic Jews, people who are proud of their race and religion and especially concerned about the coming of the Messiah. Messianic Jews in the 20th century are those who have believed, as in all centuries, the Messiah has come. The Messiah came in the person of Jesus the Christ of Nazareth. Although the Zealots who died here in 73 AD didn't accept Jesus as their Messiah, there were many Jews who did. When the Romans finally took Masada, the majority of Jews had fled from Palestine. They spread from Jerusalem to Rome and throughout the Roman Empire, taking their Jewish traditions and, for some, their newfound Christian faith with them. Today, Rome is a bustling city. Tourists from all around the world are pleased to come here. But in the first century, Jews and Christians weren't pleased to come here. They came here because in Jerusalem, the persecutions were so bad that they had to escape, and they came here to escape those persecutions. However, they were not in Rome very long before harassment followed them. In the year 49 AD, Claudius had given an edict which expelled all Jews and Christians from Rome. They scattered right around the known empire. But within 5 years or so, they had begun to come back into the heart of the city of Rome. And then came the disastrous fire of Rome. On the 19th of July, in the year 64 AD, a fire started in this area, which burnt out the entire housing area and the Forum. Someone had to be the scapegoat for that fire, and Nero blamed the Christians. He persecuted them bitterly, and for the next years, many Christians died in their faith, including the apostles Peter and Paul. Nero was followed in the year from 66 through to 80 by the Vespasian clan. Under Vespasian and his son Titus, there was continued persecution of the Christian. In 70 AD, Titus had wiped out all of Jerusalem, defeated the resistance in Masada, and he too returned, following that of Vespasian, to become the Emperor of Rome. The building of this Colosseum was one of the great achievements of the Emperor Vespasian. He brought thousands of slaves here from Israel, both Jews and Christians, to work as slaves in building the Colosseum. By 79 AD, he had dedicated the first 2 stories of the Colosseum. 50,000 people could sit in this Colosseum, and the very slaves that had been used in building the Colosseum were then made martyrs, butchered, murdered, for the amusement of the crowd. While the basic structure of the Colosseum still remains intact, the vast underground labyrinth of tunnels that channeled animals, gladiators and slaves into the arena is now in ruins. When Vespasian built the Colosseum, he had it designed so that the central area could be flooded for mock naval battles. The Romans would also have huge piles of earth and trees carried in by slaves, and a forest built, complete with wild animals. Then the crowd would watch from the tiered stands as the animals were hunted by the gladiators. After Nero put the blame for the fire of Rome onto the Christians, the persecution increased. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded that Nero, in order to get rid of this rumour that he had ordered the fire of Rome, set up as culprits and punished with the utmost refinement of cruelty a class hated for their abominations who are commonly called Christians. Beside being put to death, they were made to serve as objects of amusement. They were clad in the hides of beasts and torn to death by dogs. Others were crucified, others set on fire to serve to illuminate the night when daylight failed. Nero had thrown open his grounds for the display and was putting on the show in the circus. Nothing symbolises the clash between the might of the Roman Empire and the vulnerability of those early Christians than this Colosseum, because here they came and in their vulnerability died. The Apostle Paul realised there was a concept of weakness that was very important here. The death of Christ upon the cross, his own death, the blood of the martyrs, were all symbols of the vulnerability and the weakness of believers in comparison to the might of the empire. That weakness he frequently spoke about as a thorn in the flesh of the church as well as in himself. Personally, he was suffering from malaria or ophthalmic disease, but that weakness was given over to the grace of God. And my grace is sufficient for you, said God, for in your weakness is my strength made perfect. Without his weakness, Paul would still have been a great man, great like Augustine or Luther, but he would never have been Paul. The concept of weakness was very important to the understanding of the apostle, for he understood that through human weakness, God could do amazing things. As the Christians suffering under the persecutions of Rome heard Paul talk about how God was able to take their weakness and turn it into strength to endure suffering, they were greatly encouraged. It was only when they acknowledged their weakness that God was able to give them hope for the future. Another source of encouragement was one particular letter written especially to those suffering persecution. This letter to the Hebrews, to Jewish Christians, encouraged them greatly. Along the Via Appia, the old Appian way that leads from the Roman port of Ostia Antica to the very centre of Rome, are the catacombs or underground galleries for the burial of the dead. Dug out of the soft tufa, they were an economical and efficient use of land. Today, it's possible to descend into many of them and to almost recapture the atmosphere of the first century as Jewish Christians hid from persecution. To escape the authorities and persecution, Christians came and hid in these catacombs. There are more than 40 catacombs around Rome and about 700 kilometres of underground tunnels. Here they buried their dead, but they also used these tunnels as places to hide from persecution and escape. Occasionally they met here for worship. And can you imagine before dawn on one morning, a group of Christians in one of the largest segments praising God together and having a communion with a visiting preacher like the Apostle Peter or Paul. During the persecutions, there was one letter that greatly encouraged them. It was the letter written to the Hebrews, to Jewish Christians who were facing severe persecution. It was written about 70 AD, because there's no mention in the letter to the Hebrews about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which occurred at that time. Although, had it been destroyed, it would have greatly helped the argument that Christ had superseded the Old Testament law and the temple. Who wrote this letter to the Hebrews? We don't know. It was probably Apollos, at least that's what I think. He had to be a friend of the Apostle Paul, he had to be extremely eloquent, he had to know Jewish history, he had to have the background of the faith and understand as Paul preached. What was the purpose of writing the letter to the Hebrews? It was very simple: to encourage these Christians here to stand firm in their faith under persecution. It was to encourage them to have their hearts full of belief, no matter how tough it was. And so, to these letters, to these Christians, in these circumstances, the letter to the Hebrews came. Its final purpose can be summed up in one of the last words. It says, "Listen patiently to these words of encouragement." The final message of the book of Hebrews is one of great encouragement. The writer was wanting those early Christians, in spite of their suffering, to be steadfast in their faith. He said, "Remember how since the light of God has shone upon you, how you have suffered for your faith and yet remained faithful. You have been publicly mistreated. You have suffered the loss of all things. Some of you have had your belongings seized, and you have been imprisoned for your faith, and yet you have endured steadfastly." He told them that they belonged to a great band of heroes of the faith. And as he concludes his book, the writer to the Hebrews has this magnificent 11th chapter where he has a roll call of all the fathers of the faith. Why, he says, "Remember the faith of Abel and Enoch, of Noah, of Abraham, of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, of Moses, right down to the time of our Lord Jesus himself. All of these, by faith, had received the blessings of God." And then he concludes with a word of encouragement to them in one of the most lyrical passages ever recorded in Scripture. "Remember," he said to them, "how these people, through faith, had fought against great countries and won, how you have been mighty in battle, how women had received the dead back to them through resurrection to life, how you've defeated great armies and died under the faith, how you've been raised to walk in new life. Why, some have been stoned, they have been sawn in two, they have been mocked, they have been whipped, they have been chained and imprisoned, killed, torn apart by lions." And I'm sure they were thinking of arenas like this Colosseum. And yet by faith they had won. And surrounded, he concludes, surrounded as we are by such a great crowd of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, leaving aside every weight and sin that clings our path, looking unto Jesus, who, despising the shame, looked under the cross and is seated now at the right hand of God the Father. That was the message of the book of Hebrews, and in the spirit of the cross still lies the hope of the world.